And now we're going to a session about the relationship of venture investment in the Bitcoin SV ecosystem. I've got a great panel with some people both in studio here in New York with me as well as virtually. I'll introduce them quickly and then let them each talk for a moment about their various roles in this ecosystem. So quickly, it's Paul Rajchgod, who is Managing Director for Private Equity of the Air Group, Calvin Ayers Family Office. Zach Resnick, who is Managing Partner of Unbounded Capital. And appearing virtually on our stage, we have two other participants. That would be Bradley Rotter, who is co-founder of the Entanglement Research Institute, and Jan Smit, who is general partner of 2Hop Ventures. I think they'll be appearing on our digital screen momentarily. There they are. Great to see you, gentlemen. So let's start with our people in studio. Paul, will you introduce yourself and what you do?
Sure. First of all, socially distanced hello to my New York fellow panelists and to Bradley and Jan. Good to see you, wherever in the world you might be. And shout out to my colleagues back in Antigua. So yes, it's Paul Rajchgod. I'm Managing Director of Venture Investments at Calvin Ayers Venture Capital Group. We invest solely in companies building on Bitcoin SV's blockchain to take advantage of, as Calvin would say, its unique superpowers, which I think is a great way to sum it up.
Zach, please introduce Unbounded Capital.
Hi, I'm Zach Resnick, founder and managing partner of Unbounded Capital. We're a firm investing in the Bitcoin SV ecosystem across several funds, making both venture investments as well as we have hedge fund products. And like Paul, we believe in the future of the Bitcoin SV ecosystem and companies using the technology. Our firm began not as a Bitcoin SV ecosystem focused fund, but as a more kind of opportunistic and general crypto and blockchain fund. And after we learned more about Bitcoin, we felt the only choice of fiduciary we had was to focus in on the BSV ecosystem.
Great. Jan, please tell us about 2Hop Ventures.
Hi, Jimmy. My name is Jan. I'm general partner and founder of 2Hop Ventures, together with my beloved colleagues Alex, Jerry, and Adriaan. We are registered and based in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. We are a pure venture capital fund, so we only invest traditionally into equity in startups. Our main investments now are Sendby, Handcash, and Run. And if people like them as much as we do, then come talk to us to also own a share of these companies.
Great. Now, Bradley, you are a new face to the Bitcoin SV ecosystem. A lot of our BSV community out there probably are wondering who you are. I want you to take a little bit of time now to tell us about your business and investment experience and your journey in Bitcoin to getting here.
Thank you very much, Jimmy. It's good to see you, and hats off to you for this conference. Not only is BSV going to change the world, but I think this CoinGeek Conference has changed the way crypto conferences will happen in the future. It's amazing execution, and it's really fun to be involved. I started out as a child. I started trading commodities at a very young age, and after West Point, raced back to Chicago and helped pioneer an asset class called financial futures at the very beginning. I was on the floor of the Chicago Board of Trade and Chicago Mercantile Exchange, where grown men yelling, kicking, screaming, shoving, and spitting. It was fabulous. Those markets exploded, and as a result of being in the right place at the right time, I began investing in another new asset class called hedge funds, starting in 1982. So that's been my primary activity until 9/11, when I began focusing as an impact investor on companies that impact the security of the homeland. So it was that work in cybersecurity that allowed me to stumble onto Bitcoin in early 2013, and so I've been breathing the space since that time, and involved in not only just Bitcoin, but some really interesting projects like MadeSafe and Factum and Ethereum, Cosmos, Casper. So I've had a wide range of interest in this space, and I had not paid attention to BSV whatsoever until I met Zach Resnick and the team from Unbounded, and those guys have really impressed me. I became an investor days after meeting them, and it's been a very interesting journey thanks to them learning about what I think is the most exciting crypto protocol that I've seen.
And what has gotten you interested, Bradley, we'll stay with you for a moment, in investing not just in Unbounded Capital, but in BSV Ventures yourself? What do you see as the upside opportunity for investors?
Well, I'm not as excited as maybe the marketplace is on BSV at this moment as money or as a currency. What I see that I've been looking for many years is that the BSV and this vision of being the database for the world really makes sense. I've been troubled that we have 7,439 currencies. I don't know how many protocols, and it's exciting to see the Cambrian explosion of all these ideas. The analogy I use is it's like 1,000 golf foursomes playing universal best ball. All these ideas are popping up and changing the trajectory of how things are developing. But having a stable BSV database for the world makes tremendous sense to me, because it will allow us for the first time in history to price data and computation. And when you price something, it makes it more efficient, more usable. And I think what excites me the most is that BSV, as my pal George Gilder would say, it's a layer of factuality, and that's just an amazing concept that's going to change. It's going to change everything.
Well, we'll hear from George Gilder a little bit later. I hear he was in the house here already. Let's talk about specific types of things that interest you from an investment standpoint. In the BSV ecosystem, what kinds of things are you looking for that draw your attention for a BSV venture? Paul.
Well, I'm going to maybe answer this a little bit differently than my peers might. The way we kind of look at the ecosystem, there's been so much development so quickly, it's an absolute whirlwind, and that's putting aside the conference, which is a whole additional layer of whirlwind. But there's so much development going on that I think the way that we look at it at Air Group is there's enough of a base layer now of companies and industries represented kind of at the early stage level in the ecosystem that we've sort of shifted our attention now, for the most part, to what we call growth stage companies. And that means something different to different people, but I would say kind of like 20 to 30 employees upwards, toward 100 employees type sized companies that already have good revenue, are probably break even or close to break even, and are now, growing to that next stage. And what's great about these kinds of companies is, and when they come to the BSV ecosystem, in some cases from other blockchains, in some cases they're new to blockchain altogether, they're of a pretty material size, relatively speaking. They can bring a lot of transactions and a lot of value to the ecosystem. That's kind of where we shifted our focus.
Okay. Zach, do you have any particular industry sector, technology area focus when you're looking for things at Unbounded Capital?
Yeah, our focus is on early stage infrastructure companies. Okay. So we like investing, whenever we're able to, but ideally at the earliest possible stage, being the first check-in and playing a meaningful role in helping, generally a single entrepreneur or founding team grow. And when we say infrastructure, that could be broad, that could be narrow. What do we mean by that? So we mean it in somewhat of a broad sense, but it's infrastructure that will allow other companies to use Bitcoin. And some of examples of that are portfolio companies that everyone here knows: Handcash, Planaria, Run, Zokin Labs that Jack spoke at length in his speech yesterday. And what we like about all these different companies is that not only are they allowing people to use Bitcoin, but because of the ability to have micropayments and take very small amounts of each transaction, now these core infrastructure companies that allow developers to build on top of Bitcoin can actually capture a larger market share. So I think something that Silicon Valley looked back with internet investing and said infrastructure companies aren't good, they didn't really capture the value they created, similar to the way that internet protocols didn't capture the value they created. But because of the Bitcoin asset and the ability to take micropayments, I have high conviction that our infrastructure companies and broadly Bitcoin infrastructure companies will capture that value.
Great, so you're still focused on early stage, and then maybe can hand off to people like Paul at the Air Group and continue the journey
Absolutely.
with them. Jan, obviously Two Hop Ventures has made some investments. I know you look at a lot of companies in the ecosystem. What are the types of things that developers and entrepreneurs out there can do to catch your attention?
Yes, Jimmy. We also like the infrastructure layer very much. Maybe just to build a little bit on what Zach was explaining, we see two big groups in the infrastructure layer, one being the key managers, so Handcash, Shanby, Shanty, and on the other side, the data managers, Run being a good example, and Planaria and MatterCloud, because these companies will basically provide the SDKs on which the applications can then easily build. So they are very important now to get in place so that we will see this growth in the ecosystem and the growth in the number of solutions. And they will then also be able to capture part of the value that all these apps are creating. So it's just necessary to do that at this stage, but also attractive in the longer term. And that's why we focus on this layer.
Okay. And Bradley, since you're newer to looking at this space, I'm curious, especially given your very extensive investment background in other fields, what are the kinds of companies that would stand out to you in BSV?
My investments to date in private companies have been sort of niche-related companies that have the great market potential. For example, I'm the seed investor in a company called IPWE, which is putting the world's IP system and patents on a blockchain. And when you do that, you then make it easy to do things that were kind of difficult to do before. You can license them, lease them, buy and sell them, hypothecate them, and so on and so forth. So that is infrastructure, important infrastructure. That infrastructure impacts, I think, the not only the security but the trajectory of our economic future, if you will. It's those kinds of things that I think will be tailor-made to the BSV chain, if you will. Infrastructure is of course of interest. I was lucky enough to be in San Francisco when the internet broke out, and there are obviously lots of parallels between what we see here and what we see with the early days of the internet. The differences that I do see that are somewhat troubling is that in the early days of financial futures and hedge funds and even the internet, it was really sort of a cohesive effort that involved the participants and the mission that they were on. And what's impressed me about the BSV crowd is that thanks to Unbounded Capital, I've been making the rounds and getting to know the people from N-Chain and Bayesian Group. I've had the opportunity to have 3 video calls now with Craig Wright, and I find this community to be incredibly open and close, and they really seem unified, which is really important. And I think that can be the differentiator between this protocol and the other protocols, which remind me of the political angst that we're seeing in politics now. It's basically a food fight in the crypto world, and you know what? That's impacting its development. It's impacting its adoption. And so, if I could make any recommendations to the BSV crowd, I'd say continue working as a unit, as an organized, mission-driven protocol. Reminds me of the early days in the Revolutionary War, where the patriots were hiding behind rocks and trees and firing rifle shots. If this continues, if we continue to do that with BSV, it's clearly the strongest and best protocol. We just have to get the message out.
Well, there are certainly always areas of disagreement between people and companies, even in Bitcoin SV land. But I think it's clear from what I see that there is a committed consensus to the mission of one world, one chain. So disagreements are welcome, but I think it is great advice to provide our ecosystem with the importance of driving together towards the vision of one world, one chain, and I am confident we are going to do that. So now, Paul, what has been your impression, especially since we've last had a panel discussion in February, about the quality and experience of the teams, the managerial teams, for example, the tech development teams you're seeing in BSV Ventures?
It's a good question. I think generally, I find them all to be very impressive from a technology, from a technical point of view. They've come up with some really interesting, unique solutions that are only possible on Bitcoin SV. And some of them also have the added benefit of having what I would call sort of knowing themselves, knowing what their skill sets are. And by that I mean, we all have our limitations, we all have our strengths. And I think some management teams understand that and know that it might be that this is their innovation and their startup, but as they grow, perhaps their strongest skill set isn't selling to other consumers and selling to other enterprises. Maybe they don't like managing teams. So maybe ultimately, I might be the founder and CEO of my business, but maybe ultimately I'm meant to be the CTO. And that's a certain, it's a skill set that some of them I think need to understand. And a lot of them do. A lot of management teams are great at the technology, but also understand I may need to bring in some outside help to really take on the world with my technology.
Yeah, it actually takes a lot of self-confidence to be able to acknowledge, including to investors, that you're good at certain things but need help at other things. Zach, one thing I've noticed is that, especially a couple of years ago when I was speaking to a lot of companies pitching for investment, that they would suggest they're going to create a token for their venture, because there was this period of time, particularly during the Ethereum ICO craze, that everybody had a token. How relevant is it to you whether a BSV venture is planning to create its own token and issue its own token?
Well, I'd say it's relevant in that it's usually an incredibly strong negative signal. That doesn't mean that, of course, there's not businesses with their own tokens or building token protocols where we wouldn't invest in that business. And in fact, recently, as we all know, Run announced kind of USDC on top of the platform, and I view that as a positive thing.
Sure.
But I think in general, having kind of your own token, so to speak, is usually synonymous with a business or a protocol that's still kind of stuck in the 2017 ICO bubble. But the same reason that initially attracted me to crypto and blockchain, are there new business models that are really only possible when you have a certain type of loyalty program token or different types of complex security tokens that we couldn't really have right now without blockchain? Am I excited about that in the future? Yes, but I think we're still a little bit off from the ability to do that, both really more from a regulatory perspective. So for the most part now, if a business has their own token and it's not a token protocol, I would be quite skeptical. And generally that happens, and Paul, we've communicated about some of these companies where they already have their own token, they're thinking of moving to BSV, but now they already have their own tokens, they've made those promises, and that it's, even if they understand the technology of BSV, it serves as a big impediment to progress.
Okay. Jan, what are your thoughts on that question?
Yeah, very similar. If there's no absolute reason to need a token, then don't do it, right? You can incentivize people just with BSV or a stablecoin. I mean, a stablecoin is then probably the exception. I mean, we definitely welcome any startup that is able to bring stablecoin or various stablecoins to the ecosystem. I mean, that we definitely need. And then the other tokens that I would hope to see are tokenized assets, really, but real assets, and no Ponzi schemes. So I think we've been lucky in a way that it took us a while to get to a tokenization standard. We've maybe seen now the Ponzi schemes around us and realized that that's not something we want to have, and hopefully also when we have the tokenized standard or the tokenization standard, we will not start seeing those Ponzi schemes, but well, let's see.
Bradley, what do you think it will take to start getting some of the larger venture capital firms and institutional investors interested in investing in Bitcoin SV Ventures?
Good question. I want to hit real quickly the previous conversation that Jack was talking about, and that is the analogy I use with all of these all of these protocols and all of these tokens, the analogy is going to Philadelphia, having to turn your currency into Philadelphia script, and then not being able to use your cell phone because it's a different network. It's inefficient, and it's not going to be that way. So I think we again can look back to the internet with TCP and realize that we need a fundamental channel. You can do all the fancy things you want with that channel, but it's going to work better if there's one. I think the institutions are coming along nicely, as are the regulators. When the regulators really have begun to understand what these smart security tokens are all about, I think they're quickly coming to the conclusion that it's a regulator's wet dream to have these smart security tokens. The tokens know if they're restricted. The tokens know if they're vested. They know if they can only be sold to an accredited investor. So I've been to this rodeo before on Wall Street, and it's extremely similar. I call it, I think what we're going through now with the blockchainization of Wall Street was the same as the decimalization of Wall Street. And at the time, it was controversial. People on the street liked having securities priced at a quarter bit and a half because they were making a lot of money, and there were a lot of resistance against decimalization, but it didn't matter. It was the march of forward progress, and that has changed everything. I think it's very similar with the blockchainization of Wall Street. Now, keep in mind, the people aren't going to make as much money as they think on the blockchainization of Wall Street because just as in the decimalization of Wall Street, there weren't many people that made money on that except for Michael Bloomberg. Michael Bloomberg had a good business model. He took data for free from Wall Street and then sold it back to them. So,
yeah.
But it's coming, and institutional investors realize that, just as regulators have begun to understand the power of these smart securities, so will institutional investors. And they'll realize that their cost of operations, their cost of due diligence and regulation will be slashed to a great degree.
Zach, I know you're out talking to investors, potential investors, about participating in what you do. In fact, you were here in New York at a family office, type meeting I know about. When you're talking to new investors and introducing them to Bitcoin SV, do you recommend that they consider investing in both BSV Ventures and the asset itself? Or what type of advice do you give, especially given what your firm does?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is yes. So we have a few different products, but our main fund, our opportunity fund, is a hybrid venture and hedge fund, which has exposure not just to the top companies and entrepreneurs building on Bitcoin SV, but also to the asset itself through, largely through derivative exposure. So that's something I definitely recommend and, have basically my entire personal net worth behind as well. I think that, the highest kind of ROI on an investment always occurs at the lowest price. So if you want to have the highest individual ROI, putting risk aside, investing in the earliest stage companies, I think, is going to be the best bet for that. But I think a lot of investors, myself included, want perhaps more of a diversified portfolio of those companies, as well as something that is perhaps a lower ROI bet, but more of a sure thing, and that's investing in Bitcoin SV. And the way that I explain that investment is really, in some ways, it's like a venture investment in that it's more of a commodity and less of, say, a currency or a digital gold, where what you're buying is a call option on the value of the network in the future. So if you want to bet that all these companies are going to use the network in the future, I think a great way to have exposure to that is to buy the thing that's required to use the network of which there's a limited supply. So with our fund products, and then, I talk to a lot of investors that for whatever reason aren't able to invest in a fund like ours, and, especially non-accredited investors, I still, of course this is not financial advice, but I think Bitcoin SV, the asset is a fantastic investment alongside ventures.
Paul, what advice would you give to the entrepreneurs out there who are thinking of starting ventures or already have about their process in preparing themselves and their documentation to pitch for investment to maximize their chances the best?
Well, I think one of the things that we really look for, and I should add that earlier when I said we're looking more and more at growth stage companies, that is true, but we're also still looking at startups on a selective basis. But one of the things that we look for is for companies to try to think big, try to think beyond the current BSV community, the current Bitcoin SV ecosystem of users and of enterprises. And to borrow from Dr. Wright, in terms of the plumbing, we look for companies that are looking to use Bitcoin SV's capabilities as part of their backbone / plumbing. And so I think of a company like Chenti, which of course is a startup that we just invested in. And we're looking at a company like Transmira, who many of you know did the AR/VR app and have a very interesting AR/VR platform. What these companies have in common, among other things, is they're looking to reach out to the world, to a bigger global audience of customers, kind of to the masses, and are bringing a Bitcoin solution to them that they may or may not know is Bitcoin. And some of us think that's okay, some of us think it's not. But I think it's perfectly fine, because what they end up doing when they're successful is they bring the masses to Bitcoin. So I would encourage more entrepreneurs, more startups in the space to think about looking at businesses like that. Look at the business, the RegTech business that presented a little while ago called Company with K. That is also moving to Bitcoin SV and using Bitcoin SV's, I think it's part of their backbone, to offer KYB, which is KYC-like software for businesses, and putting it on chain. And you can imagine they're not screaming from the hilltops necessarily to all of their customers, hey, this is Bitcoin. It's just they're using part of the capabilities of Bitcoin SV that only Bitcoin SV has to bring that solution to their customers. And so we look for things like that. If you don't mind, I'd like to add one comment on the venture capital thing. A couple announcements were made today that may have fallen below the radar because it's such an exciting day. But and I don't want to take away any thunder from a company called Geospock that I know is presenting soon. But it's their fault for putting out a press release this morning, so I'm allowed to comment on it. Some of you may have seen that nChain is co-leading $5 million plus financing into this company, Geospock. That's an industrial Internet of Things and analytics software company. But the other investors include a company, a venture capital group called Global Brain out of Japan, that's backed by Sony Ventures, and also NTT Docomo, which I'm not mistaken is one of the biggest telecom companies on planet Earth. And so you can imagine they had very serious discussions at their board level and with their existing investors on this new group coming in. And although their press release didn't mention Bitcoin SV per se, it's led by nChain and it mentions blockchain technology. So I think it's a good bet that we now have a slew of global giant VCs that probably hadn't looked at Bitcoin SV, I'm going to guess, a whole lot beforehand, unless any of you would know otherwise. And now they're kind of in our circle, following their investments that are probably building on Bitcoin SV. And I know Company announced a little while ago that they're building part of their RegTech platform on Bitcoin SV, and they also have some big VCs behind them that are surely new to BSV. So we may not have, Andreessen Horowitz or Pantera Capital or the likes of those anytime soon. They're busy investing in every new DeFi project that comes along anyway, so we'll let them continue to do that. But I think it's very exciting to have the likes of Bradley, as well as these global giant VCs now in our midst, competing, fighting it out, I hope, for investments in some great companies.
Yeah, and to just briefly add to that, we're kind of in the background having a lot of conversations with venture capitalists that invest in cloud and data businesses. So, like you said, I think kind of A16Z and the Panteras, they're going to be probably some of the last movers to Bitcoin SV based on their current investments. But I think folks that haven't really looked at crypto or blockchain before, but that invest in data businesses, we're in conversation with many of them, and I think we're going to start to see some similar types of follow-on investments from folks at the level of Global Brains and other large multi-billion-dollar enterprises worldwide.
Very good.
Jan, let's turn to you. One of the interesting topics for debate recently on crypto Twitter is this question about whether or not Bitcoin SV ventures need venture capital funding or not, or whether they should be able to build a business model that is self-funding. What are your thoughts on that? Is there a one-size-fits-all answer for BSV ventures?
I think where it's coming from is that if you build something on a blockchain, it is probably a little bit easier to monetize thing than in the .com area. But still, I think what you can raise and therefore how much you can invest to grow is still probably not enough. So I think venture capital companies like us are still very much needed to achieve the growth that the ambitious startups in this space want to achieve. So yeah, when I hear them say that, one side I'd love it if they succeed and indeed are phenomenally successful and can raise a lot of money just from selling product, which would be of course fantastic. But so far I don't think we've seen that, and yeah, we like to support the companies instead of that.
Paul, you have any thoughts on that topic?
No, I do. I feel like, as far as I can tell from my career in finance and the work I've been doing as part of Air Group, there's really three buckets for people to raise money when they're starting up a business. They can either fund it themselves, right, with the co-founders at the table, or they can bring in friends and family. That's great, and if you can do that, as Calvin recently wrote, fantastic. That's what Calvin Ayre did earlier in his career. That's great. But if you don't have those two options, you need more capital, and you need to hire developers, even if some of them, by the way, want to get paid in Bitcoin SV because they're believers in the platform and what their companies are building. Chances are you still need some fiat, you still need some capital to hire developers, to pay the bills, to fund what will probably be many, many months, if not years, of losses, just like any other business. I don't see why that's different on Bitcoin SV, and in my experience from all the companies we've looked at, there's always a certain period of losses they have to fund, and unless they have prior successes of, nice exits where they did well themselves and can self-fund, they probably need to be in that third bucket. And I feel like maybe what this debate is about, and I'm speculating here, I feel like maybe certain people out there have had bad experiences with their own past and raising funds, and thought the VCs maybe took too much capital. But I'll give you an example of how I think it's quite healthy and normal. You end up having these debates about valuation, of course, and how much equity to give away at that valuation. And there's a company that I won't mention that many of us here on this panel were looking at, working together, and me and my investment committee ended up feeling the valuation was too high for that particular company. We had to walk away, and I'm quite sure they ended up getting investment support from one or more of the groups at this table here. And you know what that is? That's healthy and normal, and that's the capital markets, whether private or public, and that's what the VC markets look like everywhere else. And so that's normal.
Zach?
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, I think the question of whether it should or should not be, that's kind of antithetical to the spirit of, enterprise and competition and capitalism. I think what's fantastic about Bitcoin is that perhaps it requires less venture capital than before as a percentage. That's something I believe in. I think that's fantastic. I have another business, and I've started several businesses that have been self-funded or making revenue early, and I think that's great for certain types of businesses. But to say that, you shouldn't be ambitious enough to want to raise more money to grow at a faster rate than you can organically, I don't really understand that. But I am happy that it is perhaps easier to start businesses without venture capital funding because of Bitcoin.
Yeah, and different people are in different situations in life, right? Some people can afford to feed themselves while they're building a product and getting launched and trying to generate income, and other people cannot. Bradley, let's turn back to you. What advice would you give to the Bitcoin SV entrepreneurs, companies that are watching this, about what they can best focus on in the short term to advance Bitcoin SV and bring more investment dollars in just the whole space?
As I look at this from a high level, and I'm very appreciative to Zach and the people at Unbounded for helping guide my thinking. But this is really the biggest thing that I've seen since being involved in this space for 8 years. I think BSV could bring immortality, and by that I mean, how nice would it be if you could collect in an immutable chain all of the data of your life, and with a button press at the end of the year have your taxes completed, or upon your early demise all of your data and pictures and so forth could be handed down to generations that that will come after you. The one of the most exciting prospects, I think, of an immutable blockchain that represents BSV is the field of accounting. This is potentially the biggest development in the field of accounting in 300 years. Since double entry accounting, this is triple entry accounting, and so I hope that some of the people listening, will think about these broader concepts of having immortality in terms of data and what that means and how that could improve our lives.
You sound like you've been talking to Dr. Craig Wright often, because he definitely likes to talk about both immortality and accounting with the blockchain.
My
so
23-year-old
Jan, go ahead, Bradley.
I was going to say my 23-year-old son, who I started paying him his allowance years ago in Bitcoin. Son of a bitch is rich now, but he now thinks his father's pretty cool that he's gotten to know Satoshi Nakamoto.
Yeah. Well, you've just won the Cool Dad of the Year award here at CoinGeek. Everyone, Cool Dad of the Year award at CoinGeek Live 2020. Jan, so final thought from you, other than hopefully you're being a cool dad. What advice do you give to the Bitcoin SV ventures and entrepreneurs and developers out there that are starting their entrepreneurial journey?
Yeah, probably I'd say keep it simple, because lately we've had quite a few teams making plans which were so incredibly broad and covering everything that it just became impossible. I mean, they were a really good team. Everything, the presentation was perfect, but what we just would like to see is a very focused product on a very focused market, preferably customers that they know, so that we know actually they can probably achieve it. And then they can grow from there and do all kinds of other things. But boiling the ocean on day one, I think that's something that every team should avoid. It's already more difficult than you would think to get your product to a stage where you can launch it, where you can get to onboard people. So keep it simple, keep it small.
Zach, I know you and your firm have done quite a bit of research into Bitcoin SV, Craig Wright, and other related issues. What have you learned as part of that process, and what type of research and background checking about Bitcoin SV do you recommend new investors do before they start investing in this space?
Well, thank you, Jimmy. I'm obviously biased, having put together some of these resources, or more accurately, having incredible team members do most of this research. So something that I recommend to a lot of our potential investors and to all folks that are willing to put in, a few hours of time into really understanding things is reading our book, which was originally titled, Why Multi-Coin Capital and the Crypto Consensus is Wrong. We have now updated that title to How Bitcoin SV Will Win. And we have that book on our website, unboundedcapital.com. We also have a page there, which is the Bitcoin SV Overview, which is I send to folks. And that has some resources of ours, but it also has resources from folks like CoinGeek and the Bitcoin Association and many other places. And as you mentioned, we've also done some more specific types of research thing on, for example, one of our most popular pieces is why we think Craig is Satoshi and why that matters from an investment perspective. But yes, all of those resources you could find at unboundedcapital.com, and there's a bunch of great resources also on Bitcoin Association.
Great, thank you. And Paul, I know you've been on your own journey with learning about Bitcoin SV for the past, I guess, couple years now. Now that you're deeper into the world, what excites you most about investment opportunities for Bitcoin SV?
Well, this is maybe a general comment, but as we see more and more of what, again, I'll call growth stage companies that have announced just at this conference that they're building on, building for, utilizing BSV's backbone for their technology, I think it's an amazing time. And I know often people get well, crypto Twitter anyway gets very concerned about, hey, why isn't there enough development going on? But when I see the kind of announcements I see today of these really exciting growth stage companies backed by these incredible large global venture capital firms and other type of firms, I just feel like this is our time. It's happening. Bitcoin is growing up, to use one of our prior themes, and I think it's happening before our eyes. Never feels like it's happening quite quickly enough, but these are big enterprises. Even growth stage companies are big enough enterprises that to shift part of their business, part of their software platform and so on, onto Bitcoin SV takes some time. Proof of concepts and so on and so forth. But I think there's a lot of exciting things going on, and it's happening right now before our eyes.
Great. And with that, I'll end this session with this particular thought for me, which is there's no one-size-fit-all approach to anything in Bitcoin SV or in life, whether to take venture capital investment or not take venture capital investment, whether it's to pursue consumer adoption or big business enterprise adoption, whether it's to have a token or not have a token, whether it's to all agree on one thing or not agree on one thing. Life is great because it's full of diversity of approaches and ideas, and that's also what makes Bitcoin SV a total win. Thanks, and I will close this session by thanking all of our panelists for this really engaging conversation. Thank you very much.